What we learned in Fund One is it's really about the founder. Everything is about the founder.
Welcome back to the Marketing Playbook, the show where we dig into the strategies, stories, and hard-won lessons that help marketers and entrepreneurs build smarter businesses. Every episode, we pull out 3 game-winning marketing plays that you can take straight back to your team. I'm your host, Mark Friedman, and my career has been built around direct-to-consumer marketing, from direct mail and physical retail to digital commerce. This show is presented by Forder and Details Interactive. We're on episode 149 today, and my guest is Josh Payne, founder of OpenSky Ventures and CEO of Onward. Josh has done something most people only talk about. He built a company from scratch, scaled it over a decade, sold it to global private equity firm, and then did it all over again, this time as both an investor and a founder. In this episode, we're getting into the realities of subscription businesses, what separates great founders from good ones, and the emerging consumer trends quietly reshaping commerce as we know it. It's a conversation packed with perspective, pattern recognition, and a few surprises along the way. Stay with us. Episode 149 starts right now. But before we get started, a quick thank you as always to Max Branstetter of the Wild Business Growth Podcast for producing this episode. You can reach him at maxpodcasting.com to help bring your podcast to life. Let's open the playbook. Ready, break. Welcome to the Marketing Playbook Podcast. My guest today for episode 149 is Josh Payne. Josh is an entrepreneur, investor, and startup advisor. Currently, he's the general partner at OpenSky Ventures, where he invests in the future of commerce, and he's also the founder and CEO of Onward Group, a B2B retention software platform for ambitious brands. Previously, he was the founder and CEO of Stack Commerce, which was acquired by TPG, where he was a 3-time finalist for the EY Entrepreneur of the Year Award for Greater Los Angeles and recipient of the Best CEO in LA, awarded by Comparably. Josh is also an active angel investor in more than 30-plus startups and mentored to early-stage startups at Techstars and 500 Global. He's a husband, father of 3, Ironman triathlete, YPO member, and an avid explorer. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Got to shorten that bio.
Yeah, all good. All good. Thanks for joining me. We'll get to your first story in a second, but as we were getting ready for the show, you don't live in the United States. You live where?
We are in Mallorca, Spain.
And what brought you to Mallorca?
Yeah, I met my wife 15 years ago. I had studied abroad and just, like a lot of people, and just really loved that experience. And just I have always felt like Europe is a special place. And growing up, I didn't get to have that experience. I think I flew until I was like 20 years old or something, and I wanted that for my kids. And so I told her that on our first date. And then after I sold the company, there was an interesting kind of moment where it was like, could we do this? Could we do this now in our lives? When I'm 45, and kind of in the peak of my career, and starting a venture capital fund, and starting a new business. And at first, the feeling was like, no, it's not feasible. Now is not the right time. The kids are kind of young. And then I really kind of pushed against that. I said, why not? And we started sort of inching towards that goal. And my wife is half Venezuelan and she speaks Spanish, and we really have fallen in love with Spain in general before the trip. And it's just a really easy living place. There's not a lot of fanfare, and people are super nice. So we made it happen.
That's great. It's a good story. We had chatted about some business things, over the last, few months, and I don't think I ever realized in that conversation that you were not in the United States. And, as I was mentioning that to you, you were saying that, yeah, that's kind of the point, right? So maybe elaborate a bit.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't at all a vacation. Fortunately, both of the teams that I built and are working on, both across venture and the startup, are remote. And I think if you're doing it right, you're integrating your ambitious life with your ambitious work and finding a way that works for you to make that work. And I think the last 10 or 20 years, there's kind of been all this talk about work-life balance. And I think for founders, it's really, there is no balance. I think for founders, you end up, if you focus on balance, the scale is always tilted towards, or not always, oftentimes tilted towards work, and it feels out of balance all the time. And so the question for me was like, how can I integrate my work into my life instead of delaying life? How can I sort of wedge work through it or into it in a way that like works for everyone? It's not perfect. I mean, but there are a lot of times when I'd rather not be working, and there's a lot of more temptation here, but it's been really good. If I showed you all the graphs for OpenSky and for Onward, they're all up and to the right. And I don't think you would be able to plot when we came and when we're leaving. You know what I mean? So yeah.
So we get first story usually as we start the show, but in your case, there was a little bit of some other interesting stuff to hit. But this first story is, was there something in your upbringing that might have suggested that your career would take the shape that it has?
I don't, yeah, I mean, I think just the classic thing that everyone talks about, my dad was a salesman, just almost like what you would call like a door-to-door salesman, if you will, just sort of old school. Did insurance sales, and he did industrial, supply sales, right? So just your classic salesman. And I think I watched him in that career and watched how he would, could approach people and would continually like thoughtfully and aggressively kind of come back and reintroduce himself. And I learned a lot from him in that process. And I think it was also just ambitious in terms of and from an early age, the classic delivering newspapers at a paper route. I started mowing lawns, shoveling snow, all that. It's sounds cliche, but it's true. And I think those cliches are there for a reason.
Early in your career, maybe one of your starts, strategic partnership role at Intel. How did you get into that role pretty early on?
Yeah, so I was a computer information systems major, which was like the business side of computer. So I wasn't quite smart enough to be computer science, which was programming. So I did the business side, knowing that I had that affinity for sales. And I graduated in 2002.
Indiana.
Yeah, I went to IU, went to Indiana University in Bloomington.
I call that out because the fellow Max who produces and edits this show is an Indiana guy, and he likes to make point of that.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, the Hoosiers. Yeah, so it was sort of dot-com era, and you got to remember now, you talk to graduates now, and everyone is starting a company. Every 22-year-old is starting a company. Everyone's learning programming, or an AI prompt engineer, and everyone wants to be an entrepreneur. That really wasn't the case 25 years ago. 25 years ago, banking and consulting really ruled the world in terms of what postgraduates wanted to do. Most of my friends were finance and econ majors, so being CIS was a little bit different. And anyway, I got an internship with Intel in my junior year, which I was really fortunate. And I remember getting my full-time offer. It was like a month before things really melted down, and Intel ended up rescinding a ton of offers, but somehow, some way, mine wasn't, and made it out to Silicon Valley. And that was the dream. Just being in the epicenter of tech. If you're an actor, you needed to be in LA. If you're in finance, you needed to be in New York. So getting out there, I credit that to being a huge part of the evolution of my career.
During that early part of the career, there was Intel, there was Yahoo, there was a business called Meebo. What was Meebo?
Meebo, yeah. So basically, that quick arc there was Intel. To be honest, I couldn't stand working in corporate America. Quickly learned that this was not for me. I was sort of like the best worst employee, who was doing the bare minimum to get along, and not get fired. But I also wasn't. It was interesting. I was too risk adverse to not have a full time gig. I had no fallback. My parents didn't have any money. I had student loans. Bills had to be paid. So it wasn't like I could just quit. And but like I remember waking up, living in San Francisco, and just kind of like being like, "What the fuck am I doing with my life?" I actually I remember I called it my quarter life crisis. I was 25, and just sort of like felt so unfulfilled, but I also felt stuck because I knew what I wanted, but I didn't know how to get there. I didn't know how to be an entrepreneur. No one ever told me. I wasn't from a tech family. I didn't grow up in California. No one in my family was an entrepreneur. And so I felt this internal strife, that was just constantly going. And I couldn't figure out how to give up what I had in order to take this sort of cross the chasm, if you will, into entrepreneurship or into something different. And so what I ended up doing is I applied to business school to Duke, which was sort of this bridge. Even though I knew the business school wasn't really going to get me to entrepreneurship, I knew it would open up a gap. And it would give me like 2 years to kind of think and hopefully meet people and network. So I came out of Duke 2 years later. It was then the financial crisis of 2008. So I graduated in the dot-com crisis for undergrad, and then I had the financial crisis for my MBA. And so jobs were super, super scarce, and I couldn't find anything. So I just moved back to Silicon Valley, knowing that I would be in better shape. Applied everywhere, got really close at a bunch of places, but ultimately, Meebo was this venture-backed startup backed by Sequoia. So really fast growing, had like 20 or 30 people when I started. And that's really where I cut my teeth. That's really where I learned what entrepreneurship was. I actually sat right next to this guy, Mikey Krieger, who went on to co-found Instagram. And now I think he's like CPO at Anthropic or maybe it's Perplexity, one of the big LLMs, which is crazy. And so learned a lot. But I love that job. I love that team. And then I got fired a year later, a year into it, which was devastating. It was sort of like I had never had anything like that happen to me before. Didn't really understand why I was hired by one manager and then transferred to another manager. And I think my new manager didn't hire me and didn't know me, wanted their own people. And so I think it was a little bit of a collateral damage there, but also it was just a huge wake up call, and that still I was in this process of how do I start this company, right? I was really close. I had met these people. I had seen what it was like. I loved everything about startups, but I still was not a developer. I wasn't a coder, so I started building on the side, but I still needed to pay the bills, and that's where Yahoo came in. So I was like, okay, I need a gig that's stable, pays the bills, but I'm not working 60 hours a week. And Yahoo provided that opportunity. And so everyone has a different risk threshold. And so for me, it's interesting. I'm an entrepreneur, but I'm not terribly risky. I don't take a lot of risk, which you'll kind of see in the way I build my businesses. And so I worked at Yahoo, and I was building on the side. I probably built two or three companies over the next 3 years, two of which failed. And then the third one, which was Stat Commerce, caught.
This episode is brought to you by Forder, and they've got something worth hearing about. There's a conference coming up in New York on October 14th called Impact, and I'll actually be there. So if you're planning to attend, I'd love to connect in person. It's built for e-commerce leaders navigating AI, agentic commerce, and the very real pressure on margins right now. Practical conversations, senior people, real challenges to solve. If you want to go, and I think you should, there's a promo code that gets e-commerce leaders like you in for free. Just head to forder.com/impact and use the code PLAYBOOK, all lowercase, at checkout. That's forder.com/impact, and the code is PLAYBOOK, PLAYBOOK, all lowercase. Enjoy the conference. Why don't you stick with that one? Talk about Stack Commerce and what that was. And, there's so many different pieces of emotion. You're starting a business, you ultimately sell it. There's emotional attachment, I imagine, that comes, now a paycheck or a big check. I'm surmising if you had a nice exit, sometimes that covers, any emotional. But what was Stack Commerce?
Yeah. So Stat Commerce, it's so interesting. Founders think that they have to, or people who are building but haven't launched yet, think that they need to build the perfect thing, think that they need to have it figured out. And my tactic has been different. It's to get a toehold and just find a niche, find something that works, that makes money right away, that has traction really quickly, that you can sort of heat test really quickly with some ads or with some money. And so we did that. So the very first iteration of Stack Commerce was this idea of selling software in bundles. So consumers, instead of you buy in the app store today on your phone, but 15 years ago, people used to buy software on their desktop for $50 per app, and it was a one-time purchase, and there was no subscription. And so we would get 10 software developers, app developers together at once and say, hey, we're going to get you 1,000 downloads, but you have to discount your product 90% in order to do so. And you're going to create some brand awareness, and then those people hopefully go on to buy next year's version at full price, right? And then we would do a 50-50 rev split on that first sale. So that was the very first version of Stack Commerce. It was essentially Groupon for software, if you will, right? So Groupon in 2010 was the fastest growing company in the world. People forget that. Like literally the fastest growing company in the world. And so everyone was creating a Groupon clone. And so what was great about the business that I started, even though it wasn't sexy, there was no marginal cost. I was creating value for both sides of the transaction. I was creating value for the app developers in terms of awareness, and I was creating value for the consumers inherently by getting them a 90% discount that they couldn't otherwise get. And I was getting 50% margins still on what I was doing. And so that very first bundle, I always tell the story, like, I'll try to make it quick, but I spent 6 months reaching out to these developers, getting them to give me this discount, telling them I was going to sell 1,000 bundles. I said it's a 2 week event, okay, a 2 week flash sale. So we launch first day, zero sales. Second day, like one sale was like my mom. Third day, sales started to kind of trickle in. By the end of the week, I think we had like maybe 100 sales, and I was completely panicking. I called my dad and frankly broke down in tears and just like, wow, I let all these people down. I told them I was going to sell 1,000 copies. There's zero chance I get to 1,000 copies. This is yet another failure. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. And, his advice was really sage, which was, I was like, what can I do? What do I do? And he's like, send another email. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, send another email, send another email, like take another swing until something clicks. And I was still working for Yahoo at the time and called in sick. I was living in LA actually for the summer for this specific reason, and then flew back up to San Francisco. Steve Jobs was alive and presenting at Moscone Center, and I was selling Apple software. That's what the 10 apps were. And so I went out, printed out flyers, and stood in front of Moscone Center, like handing out flyers about my digital bundle that these people could buy. Then I snuck into the conference and whatever, and I met the founder of one of the top Apple blogs online called Cult of Mac. And so he's like, hey, yeah, great to meet you. Come by the party later if there's room. And so I go over to the party. I get there. The person doesn't know that I know this guy, and they're like, no, you can't get in. And I'm like, oh God. So then long story short, I sneak into this party, find the guy, and I'm like, hey, like, you said you were interested in this, will you post about it on your blog? And he's like, I don't know, like, sure, kid, I'll post about it. So the next morning, a post goes live. We sell 600 bundles in a day. And then another blog post, repost their post on a different blog. So I get another 200 sales. By the end of the week, we hit the 1,000. That was it. The rest is history. We just kept going.
So, one of the things about this show is we try to give the listeners three key takeaways that they can take back to their personal or professional lives. And, I think there's about five that you just gave. It's don't give up, the stick-to-itiveness of, and sometimes pivoting really quickly to something that, didn't work and trying something else. So, that's awesome. So, lots to cover here, but with respect to Stack, you then sold it to TPG. And just quickly, was there any emotional attachment to that business? Did you stay on after it was sold?
Yeah, so we ran that for 10 years. From the story I just told to the exit was about a 10-year period. And we did something I like to call seed strapping. So we raised a little less than $1 million and got profitable and just scaled it up from there. Yeah, we sold to TBG for a majority stake, rolled a percentage, and so I stayed on for a year. And yeah, that period of selling was really interesting, right? Yeah, in terms of like your identity being wrapped up in that thing and then kind of trying to manage a really big change monetarily. And I think for a lot of founders, you kind of think, well, why am I doing this? Well, I'm doing this to make a lot of money, and then when I make a lot of money, all my problems will be solved. And Mark, you've been around for a long time in business and done really well, I'm sure. And it's just, I mean, it just doesn't work like that. Money is nice, but it does not solve all your problems. And I think that's a big letdown to find that out, to find out that you've been chipping away at something, and then to get to it and just say, oh wow, like this didn't do what I thought it was going to do was really devastating.
It's a means to an end, and it's something you need, money. But you're right. There's lots of things that it doesn't, solve. So that's another good call out, for folks. So great story around Stack Commerce, and there's kind of three other pieces of probably more, but to your background, this business called Retention Brands. So that's kind of what I would characterize as a roll up of businesses. So what's the status of that and your role in it? And I guess the overarching question for me, does a roll up business work? And the reason I ask is because I have seen so many roll up businesses in the consumer space fail over time.
Yeah. So Retention Brands is run by a good friend of mine, Chris Davis. And so that's really his idea and baby. And I'm a minority shareholder and investor and advisor. And so Chris previously had run a company called Loot Crate in the subscription space, and it had done really well, and ultimately fell into bankruptcy. And so he learned a lot about bankruptcy and what happens and in that process. And so his thesis here was to go out and acquire brands that were or could be run through an assignment for the benefit of creditors, which is an ABC process, and bring them out on the other side clean. So if before that process, you might owe a lender $5 million. After that process, you owe them nothing, and all the old stakeholders lose their equity. But you put a new cash infusion in, and then it's negotiate with some of the creditors, and you bring it out. So through that, Retention Brands has purchased, let's see, Birchbox, All True, Beachly, more recently a brand called Able Clothing. And so, yeah, I think, yeah, it's a dogfight. All right. I mean, when you're bringing brands out of bankruptcy, especially. But the benefit for Retention Brands is that they're all subscription based businesses, so they have large subscriptions that they're kind of holding on to. I mean, that said, I do think the holdco model for brands is a really tough one. Yeah, I'd agree with that assessment.
You've talked a lot about subscription, and I know that's an important part of the businesses that you've been involved with. Being a subscription business or having a subscription as part of your business is a unique challenge that other brands maybe don't have. What are the challenges that those businesses face? There's churn and other things, and how have you been able to get through those challenges?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is your CAC is a little bit higher, right? Because your CAC is a little bit higher because you're asking someone to sign on for a multi purchase, right? As opposed to like a one-time purchase. And so, you have to be prepared to be able to spend a bit more in order to get that higher lifetime value. I think the other thing is sometimes you spend assuming a six-time repeat, but you only have a three-time repeat, and that can get you upside down really quickly. So really paying attention to cohort data and saying, okay, like, well, what happened in this cohort and why did it go? Why did things improve or why did things get worse? And then remeasuring each month, as you kind of go along. So I think subscription based, generally as an investor, I can tell you through OpenSky, we really are favoring subscription based businesses because the certainty of revenue is just higher, right? And so you can manage the down months, and you're not always reacquiring customers as often. And I think you see that a lot in the exits too. A lot of these like Runes and different companies are very subscription heavy.
Do you find that the subscription business is very similar across verticals, whether it be supplements or apparel or what have you, or are there nuances within different verticals?
I mean, mostly you see subscription and consumables, right? So apparel doesn't typically have it. I mean, I guess like the box. Yeah, yeah, the boxes. but those have mostly subsided. There aren't that many new box companies. I think that was a trend that is like 5 or 10 years old now, and you don't really see much of that anymore. I'm not sure if it's. I think the economics of like kitting the boxes and getting those together was, maybe quite expensive. But yeah, I think the game that you see most people playing today is around subscription is supplements and consumables with really high margins and getting people to layer in there. Yeah, I think there is the idea of memberships for apparel, and I know you have some relevant interest there and experience there, but I think memberships for apparel can be really powerful. So it's just really all upside, right?
Yes, you would hope so. The devil is in the details. You probably have heard that phrase time and time again in your professional life. Projects get started with great intentions, but you no longer have the time to pay attention to the little things that could make the difference between success and failure. At Details Interactive, you can discuss your business with a seasoned direct to consumer marketing executive who's helped launch and grow web businesses and integrate multi channel marketing initiatives. Learn more at detailsinteractive.com. You mentioned a few times today this business, OpenSky Ventures. Tell us about that and how it got started.
When I sold Stat Commerce, I started investing in startups more and more. Now, I had done one or two investments prior to that, one in a company called Teachable, founded by this guy, Encore Nagpal, which had a really successful exit. Then my second investment was in a company called Postscript, which is a SMS platform. Both the guys that started that actually worked for me at Stat Commerce for actually one for 7 years, one for four. And so I was kind of like, oh man, I'm incredible at this angel investing thing. That was pre-sale, and then after I sold, and it was 2021, so it was literally the peak of valuations, and that cohort of angel investments had not done terribly well. But I learned a lot from that. And one of my investors in Stat Commerce was this guy, Josh Resnick. He founded a company called Sugarfina, which was a luxury candy brand, and we got together, and he was doing a lot of CPG investments. I was doing a lot of B2B e-commerce enablement investments. And so we said, hey, no one's really put together a fund that kind of does both of these things and is a sort of a full cycle B2B and B2C future of commerce fund. And so we put together fund one in 2022, which unlike 21 was very prescient and incredible timing, sort of the old Warren Buffett, be greedy when others are fearful and be fearful when others are greedy. So I didn't follow that advice in 21, but we did follow it in 22, and we started writing checks in late 22 and early 23 and really getting great valuations and incredible founders. And Fund One has done extremely well. I think on an unrealized gains basis, we're well into the 40% IRR range. Have a lot of great names in the fund, and now we're raising Fund Two and doing it, doing it all over again. And pre-seed and seed is kind of our realm. And fund one was kind of 100K to 250K check sizes, and fund two is more like 200 to 500.
And are there specific types of companies, particular verticals, capability that you're focused on?
Yeah, I mean, on the consumer side, like I said earlier, I think it's really about high margin, high repeat, and really disruptive. So just I think one thing that we've noticed around consumers, it's really around these mega trends, right? So every couple years you see a new trend. Like, I don't know, 10 years ago it was like collagen, and 8 years ago it's right, it's creatine, or a couple years ago it was creatine, and now it's protein. So every protein infused candy, protein infused chips, protein infused ice cream. So that's like there's sort of like a trend. And then there's a form factor trend as well. So pouches are now a big trend, or gummies were a trend 2 or 3 years ago, or right. And so I think you kind of have to evaluate and see where we are in these cycles. And then the other thing is yeah, just figuring out. I mean, it's really what we learned in Fund One is it's really about the founder. Everything is about the founder.
I was just going to ask, that was my next question is, tell me about, what you're looking for in the founder, because it really is about maybe it's the form factor, maybe it's the fad of the moment, but it's really about the founder. So tell us what you look for in the founder.
Yeah, I mean, it's part. raw intelligence, it's part charisma, it's part, you know, at the end of the day, it's someone who can lead and sell. They can sell a great team to join. They have to be able to sell investors to put money to work, and they have to be able to manage all of that while bringing an incredible, innovative product to the consumer. It really takes a really dynamic person, and you can kind of sense when someone can command the room right away. And I think the challenge for investors sometimes is I mean, it's so hard because you know, you see a great founder and like, oh, I don't know if I really like this product, or I would never take this product. And then, you know, we had a couple of those. You know, for example, we looked at Groons, which just sold for 1.2 billion. We looked at their pre-seed, and we had the chance to invest at a 10 million cap, and we passed because we thought, you know, who would want to take five sugary gummies every day to get healthy? You know, like, yes, they have creatine in them, but like, or greens, but ultimately it didn't seem terribly helpful, you know, healthy, to us. And we kind of thought, oh, you know, this is just a short trend or whatever. And you know, Chad, who's the founder CEO of Grins, is incredible, and he had one. We were probably wrong on the trend. You know, we were basing off of our own personal taste, not broader taste. And then secondarily, you know, the founder was able to raise so much capital and put it to work efficiently and so fast. It was just something that the market had never really seen. He sort of blitzed the market and did really incredibly well. So we kind of learned from that. You know, even if we don't necessarily, even if a product isn't necessarily for us, you know, that's fine. You know, that should be fine. And secondarily, when we're kind of thinking about the founder, it's about their ability to get people to believe in them. And you know, I like, we have, or at least I personally have this idea that startups don't necessarily need to raise 100 million plus to have a great exit. And Chad did in that example. They raised a ton of money but sold for a ton, and that was amazing. But I do think, even if we don't want them raising 100 million, the ability to gain the confidence of investors and raise more capital when needed is really, really important, because otherwise you just kind of, you run out of runway, and you never get to live out your vision.
So in that particular example, you said it wasn't for you. In retrospect, and sometimes you want to strike quickly. In retrospect, do you need broader research from customers, you know, other than your own potential bias to see if there really is a there?
Yeah, it's funny. Josh Resnick has three kids, and so he always has. They're older; they're in their like 20s. He always has them try everything now, you know, and like, let me run it by my kids real quick, you know. And their opinions, Gen Z opinions, are different than ours, you know. So I do think it's actually helpful to have a couple sample sizes on both sides for sure.
You and I met through conversations with your business called Onward. Tell us about Onward.
Yeah. So Onward is, so coming out of Stack Commerce. We were selling, it was B2B to C, so we were powering marketplaces, and those marketplaces were generating about nine figures in annual revenue and GMB. And the challenge is that our customers wanted more and more from us. They wanted more loyalty points. They wanted free returns. They wanted free shipping. They wanted sort of, you know, everything. Well, why is that? Well, that's what I get from Amazon, right? Like, you know, Amazon does this or that. And you know, we kind of looked at the space, and there were some products out there that were sort of add-ons at checkout around shipping protection and things like that. And I thought, that's interesting, but it didn't hold enough value in my mind for the consumer. And so we built what I thought was sort of a hybrid model of, Amazon Prime is an annual membership. So you pay, you know, 150 bucks a year or whatever it is. I didn't think that would really work for most consumer brands. So we said, what if we could do a one-time fee where you pay $2 or $3 at checkout for an order upgrade? Well, what do you get for that? Well, you get 10% credit off your next order. We'll make a donation to charity. You get a free return shipping label, and so for $2 or $3, you're getting 20 or $30 of value. And so I kind of likened it to the Amazon or MX Platinum model. So where you pay 700 bucks for a credit card, but you get $3,000 of credit to Uber and hotels and whatever. And so that's a model that we thought was a win, not only for the brand, but also for the consumer. And so I started that in 2023, and it's just really taken off. I think mainly because our solution has just been, again, had value to both sides of the equation. There were a lot of offerings in the space that were just really kind of better for the brand and not so good for the consumer. And we kind of felt like ours was different, and we saw a much higher LTV from our cohorts. And I think, yeah, so that's what Onward. Well, that's how it started, and then yeah, I can tell you more.
One of the things I think that is interesting is, in my as I got my education, there's a lot of companies doing it very similarly. How do you view yours as your business as being different and better?
Yeah, so I think in the same vein at Stack Commerce, we started with this one bundle, and then that grew into a completely different business. We didn't really get into what Stack Commerce grew into being, and the evolution, but the same is happening and happened with Onward. We started with this one product which we call Checkout Plus, which is this order upgrade at checkout. But now we have a full suite of post-purchase apps, which includes returns and exchanges, kind of like a loop returns. It includes branded order tracking. It includes order editing and upsells. And we're about to make another big addition tomorrow, where we're acquiring a company and going to make a big announcement. But we're sort of tying together an entire suite really focused on being a revenue engine, right? Like we want to drive incremental profit for brands in a way that also improves the customer experience. So it's not a trade-off, like I mentioned earlier, like giving, 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 but losing money, or increasing profit but taking away things. And so we want to create this offering that kind of does both.
One of the things that's interesting, just going back to your OpenSky conversations, what's out there now that we maybe have not really heard a lot about? Not necessarily a company, but a trend. You mentioned, is it protein or creatine or whatever? Is there something new that we should be having our eyes on?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing in consumer that's really interesting for us that we're trying to nail down is the science-backed GLP-1 and peptide type of products. You're seeing people be very hyper curious about getting an edge. If there's one thing I've learned by living in Europe and looking back at Americans, is that the US audience, everyone wants an edge. They want a quick fix. They want a boost. And what social media and science are telling us is on the horizon are drugs, or I don't know, peptides, or what products, let's just say broadly, that can provide an edge to either lose weight, gain muscle, or a variety of things. And so we think that's going to be a massive market. There's some regulation there right now to kind of figure out and whatnot, but like that's definitely one area that we're kind of looking around and seeing what's really interesting. So I'd say that's probably one of the biggest ones. Again, the form factors. I mean, it's so interesting to see some of these companies in consumer. It's like a better pasta sauce, goes on to sell for $1 billion. I think Better for You was started 10 or 15, probably, yeah, 10 or 15 years ago in the consumer space. It continues to work. So 3 years ago, we invested in a company called Fishwife, and it was Better for You tinned fish.
My son is crazed about Fishwife. It's his favorite. And I grew up a long time ago. All you had was sardines, in a can. And now the Fishwife product, and this is a little outside the show, but I have a granddaughter who's 20 months old. We've introduced her to some of the Fishwife product, and she loves it. It's so yeah, odd things.
Yeah, that's incredible. And yeah, I mean, so it's like, what are we looking for? Yeah, I mean, the Better for You still works. Finding, Starkist tuna and all that, it's just like, the stuff that we grew up with. The problem with those manufacturers is, and I think this is a problem with, again, being in Europe, I'm not a big fan of regulation generally, but you see what happens here around, especially around food products, is the EU is really good about defending its citizens from corporate efficiencies in order to drive more profit, but potentially harm its consumers. So things like, let's just take an easy example, red dye 40 or whatever. So Europe bans that because it's not good. It's just not good for its citizens. it probably hurts some corporate profits because when a consumer looks at Skittles and you look at it with red dye 40, it visually is more pleasing. It looks more, it pops off the shelf. When you see Skittles here in Europe, they don't look the same. They literally look different. Like the color is not the same red. And so it's not as visually pleasing. And so you might not go and grab that thing, but it's going to be healthier for you. And so I think one of the things back home that we're seeing is the Starkist tuna of the world. Sorry to pick on Starkist tuna, but as U.S. based companies, we want our boards, our investors want more profit. Well, how do you get more profit out of a space that isn't growing? Right? Like, well, efficiencies. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means higher shelf life. Well, how do you get a higher shelf life? Well, you put more preservatives in it. Well, is that good for us? No, but like it's going to get more profit. And so that corporate cycle enables the introduction of a better for you category. So that was my roundabout way of saying that better for you will continue to go on because I think a lot of these legacy companies, they're not creative, and so they don't create new great things. They just squeeze, and so then that allows like someone like Fishwife to come along. And when we invest in that Josh Resnick definitely was like, I've never. This is a good example. I've never eaten fish, something like that. I wouldn't eat it, but I really pushed hard for it, and the reason why is because the branding just was incredible, and you could tell that the founder fit with their creative was just really on point.
Well, we're down to the end of the show. Lots of interesting stuff, Josh. Thanks very much. We do a 2-minute drill, 7 questions, 1-word answer. Are you ready?
All right, let's do it.
Favorite app on your phone?
I'm gonna go with Whisperflow.
Last website other than Amazon that you shopped from?
Maple Boost.
Something that you're not good at but wish that you were?
Tennis.
A charitable organization that you're passionate about?
Charity water.
If you had one superpower, what would it be?
Oh man, that's a good one. I would say the capacity for infinite love.
Oh boy, that's a new one. I haven't heard that one in 149 shows. I like it.
I'm
Other than family, what's your most prized possession?
gonna go my espresso machine.
Okay. Where can people reach out to you on social media?
At J in Payne, Payne.
Great. Hey, this was fun. Thanks for making the time, taking yourself away from the beach of Mallorca. And we'll look forward to catching up with you again in the future.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark.
That's it. Today's game ball goes to Josh Payne for coming on the Marketing Playbook. To me, today's 3 game-winning marketing plays were as follows. Number 1, bet on the founder, not just the idea. Josh made the point that great investing and frankly great hiring and partnership decisions come down to the quality of the person sitting across from you. Raw intelligence, charisma, and the ability to sell are the signals that matter most. The product will evolve, the market will shift, but a great founder finds a way. Ask yourself, in your own world, are you evaluating the people around you with the same rigor you apply to the ideas? And number 2, integrate work into your life. Don't just try to balance them. Josh moved his family to Mallorca, built remote teams, and kept his business metrics strong. His philosophy isn't about finding balance, it's about designing a life where work and things that matter to you actually coexist. That's a harder thing to build, but it's a more honest goal. What's one thing you could redesign right now to make that integration more real? And number 3, watch the cohort data, not just the top line. This one's for anyone running a subscription model or thinking about launching one. Josh was clear that subscription businesses live and die by repeat purchase behavior, and you won't see the cracks until you're looking at cohort level data. Don't get seduced by gross revenue numbers. Understand who is coming back, when, and why. That's where the real health of the business lives. Thank you, Playbook marketers, for listening to another episode. If you want to check out more pages of the Marketing Playbook, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast spot and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Until next time, the devil is in the details.